The house glowed like a magazine cover that night, garlands curling around the railings, silver candles flickering in glass holders, the air sweet with roasted ham and sugar glaze. But warmth had never lived here. Not for me. Not since Ethan learned how to weaponize a smile. Mom had set the table as if she were hosting royalty, polishing every fork until it gleamed. Dad poured the wine with the reverence of a ritual, his tie perfectly centered, his posture rehearsed. And me. I was the quiet prop at the end of the table, the afterthought that made the family portrait look balanced. Ethan leaned back, his cufflinks catching the chandelier's light. "Working on your little art thing again, Claire." His tone was mild but deliberate, dipped in something that cut deeper than the words themselves. "At 30, maybe it's time to try something that pays rent." Laughter rolled across the table, clean controlled, as if they'd practiced this exact scene every Christmas. Dad swirled his glass of Cabernet, the color deep and rich, his smile tighter than the rim. "You'll figure it out one day, sweetheart. Unless your brother's right, you'll be broke forever." The laughter came louder this time, layered like a symphony that knew all the notes of my humiliation. I kept my face still. I'd learned long ago that silence made them uncomfortable. If you don't flinch, they can't tell where to aim. My fork scraped against the plate, the metallic ring louder than it should have been. Across the table, Mom adjusted her pearls and smiled, pretending this was all light-hearted family teasing. To her, everything was a presentation. To me, it was inventory, every jab, every smirk, another reminder of what they thought I was worth. Ethan wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his grin sharp. "Maybe next year we can all pitch in and buy you a real desk. Or a chair. I assume you're still working off that kitchen counter?" His words slipped under my skin, cold and familiar. Aunt Lydia chuckled, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "You always had such a creative spirit, Claire," she said sweetly. "But sometimes creativity just doesn't pay the bills, dear." I looked up at her, the same aunt who once asked if I'd help design her holiday cards for free. They didn't see cruelty in what they said. They saw the truth, the kind they could toast to and feel proud of. Dad raised his glass again, the gold ring on his finger catching the firelight. "To my family," he said, "and to success wherever it finds us." Ethan smirked and lifted his own glass high. "Mostly here," he added, gesturing toward himself. The room erupted in polite laughter again. It was an echo chamber of self-satisfaction. I forced a small smile, the kind that says, "I'm fine when you're anything but." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Sophie, my younger cousin, watching me. Her smile was uncertain, her eyes flickering between me and Ethan. She looked like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. I couldn't blame her. In this family, silence was survival. We all knew our roles. Dad the patriarch, Mom the enabler, Ethan the golden son, and me the footnote they tolerated once a year for appearance's sake. The conversation drifted to Ethan's new promotion, his unprecedented performance in finance. Mom glowed with pride, describing his office in New York as if she'd built it herself. "He's just like your father," she said, her tone soft, affectionate. "Driven, focused, knows where he's going." Her gaze flicked toward me for half a second. "You'll get there too, Claire, in your own way." The pause between her words was heavy, almost pitiful. I let them talk, let them drink, let them laugh about stocks markets and bonuses I didn't care about. Because underneath their words, I was thinking of something else entirely, the prototype on my laptop back home. The design that might change everything. They thought I was still playing with art, but what I was building wasn't art. It was architecture for another world. They just couldn't see it yet. When dessert arrived, Thethan kept the performance going. So he said, cutting into his pie, "How's that roommate of yours, still splitting rent?" He said it like an accusation, as if sharing an apartment in downtown Charleston was a moral failure. "Actually," I said evenly, "she's my business partner now." His fork paused midair. "Business partner," he repeated, smirking. "That's adorable." Mom laughed, the sound brittle. "Oh, Claire, always full of ideas." I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. Ideas, I said softly. That's one word for it. My voice barely carried, but Ethan heard. His eyes narrowed, studying me the way a cat studies a cornered mouse. You sound confident, he said. That's new. Confidence wasn't new. It had just been quiet. I stood up to refill my glass, needing a moment away from their eyes. The dining room felt smaller every year, the air heavier with old judgment. From the window I could see the lights of the city reflected in the glass, gold and silver, like the life they thought I couldn't reach. My reflection looked different tonight. Not weaker, just waiting. When I turned back, Ethan was telling a story about his company's holiday bonus, describing the zeros like a magician pulling silk scarves from a hat. Mom laughed at all the right beats, Dad nodded approvingly, and the room spun with admiration. But Sophie's gaze found me again, uncertain and sympathetic. That tiny thread of recognition steadied me more than any applause could. I sat down, folding my napkin carefully, my pulse steadying. Let them talk. Let them feel invincible. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that while they clinked glasses over predictable success, I had already stepped into something far less safe and far more powerful. When dinner finally ended, the house exhaled. The plates cleared, the laughter thinning into satisfied murmurs. Dad clasped Ethan's shoulder, pride spilling from every word. This is what legacy looks like, he said. A man who carries the Bennett name forward. I waited for him to look at me, but he didn't. He didn't have to. I already knew my place in the family hierarchy, somewhere between the silverware and the tablecloth. I slipped my coat from the back of my chair. Mom noticed. Leaving already, honey? Stay for the coffee. Her tone was sweet, rehearsed like a script she'd read 1,000 times. I have work in the morning, I said. Of course, Ethan chimed in, smirking. Wouldn't want to interrupt your little side projects. I paused at the door, hand on the frame, the hum of their laughter chasing me. Good night, I said simply. Merry Christmas. The cold air outside hit me like a cleansing wave. The street was quiet, except for the distant sound of carolers and the faint shimmer of wind chimes. I stood under the porch light, breath fogging in the night, watching the golden windows behind me. Their laughter still carried muffled but distinct familiar as the ache in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stood there until the chill settled into my bones and everything inside me went still. Because somewhere between their mockery and my silence, a decision had formed, clear, sharp, irreversible. They saw a broke girl tonight. But what they didn't know was that failure was just the cover story of my comeback. The Bennett house always smelled the same polished perfume and something faintly artificial, like a room that had forgotten how to breathe. A week after Christmas, I came by to drop off a folder my mother had asked for, an excuse I knew wasn't necessary. She could have easily sent someone, but maybe some part of me wanted to walk those halls again to prove they didn't own me anymore. The hallway was just as I remembered, lined with gold frames and smiling faces that weren't mine. Ethan at 5, clutching his first basketball trophy. Ethan at 12, shaking hands with the mayor at some charity event. Ethan at 21, standing in front of Harvard's crimson banner, Dad's arm draped proudly across his shoulders. The walls were a museum of Ethan's perfection. My own childhood photos were there too, though you had to squint to find them. A blurry snapshot from a school play, a faded picture of me holding a sketchbook. They hung lower out of the light, as if ashamed to take up space. I ran a finger along the edge of one frame and felt a thin layer of dust. Mom would never allow dust anywhere else in the house. Only here. Only on me. Every wall in that house told one story, his. A memory hit before I could stop it. I was 10, holding my first blue ribbon from the regional art contest. It was the first time anyone had told me I was good at something. I'd spent weeks drawing the Charleston harbor boats, gulls' sunlight glinting on the water. When they called my name, I thought my heart would burst. I ran home, ribbon in hand, ready to see pride on my parents' faces. Dad was reading the paper, his glasses low on his nose. "That's nice, sweetheart," he said without looking up. Maybe next year you'll win something practical. Practical? I asked, confused. Like math or science? He said, folding the paper neatly. Something that can build a future. The door opened then, and Ethan rushed in, cheeks flushed, clutching a basketball trophy twice the size of my ribbon. "We won the state," he shouted. Mom gasped, like she'd witnessed a miracle. She pulled him into a hug, kissed his cheek, and shouted for Dad. Within minutes, they were on the phone calling neighbors, ordering a cake. I watched from the staircase, my ribbon limp in my hand. The phone kept ringing, laughter bouncing off the walls. No one asked what I had drawn. No one even noticed when I went upstairs and pinned the ribbon to my wall beside my bed. That night I could still hear the echo of their celebration downstairs. The smell of vanilla cake filled my room. My ribbon caught the moonlight, thin, small, quiet. That was the first time I learned what mattered in our house. Ethan's achievements were proof of greatness. Mine were hobbies, distractions, sweet little nothings that made people smile politely and then forget. When I turned 15, Mom bought Ethan a brand new suit for his internship at Dad's firm. She laid it out on the bed, smoothing the fabric like it was sacred. "He looks like a man already," she said proudly. "Just like your father." The same week she gave me a used book she'd found at a yard sale. "Finding Your Passion." "I thought of you," she said. "You're still figuring yourself out, right?" I smiled, thanked her, and tucked it away. I knew it wasn't cruelty, at least not the kind they could recognize. It was a habit. In their eyes, Ethan was the future. I was the filler between his triumphs. But I didn't stop drawing. I started teaching myself design software on an old laptop Ethan had left behind. It overheated every 30 minutes, the fan whining like a dying insect. Still, I learned. I built shapes, color patterns, and movements. It made sense to me in ways real life didn't. I'd lose track of time until Mom would knock on the door, sighing. "You're up again. Go to sleep. You can't live in a dream, Claire." She didn't know that the dream was the only place I felt awake. I remember once in my last year of high school, I brought home a digital art project, an animation of the marshes at sunrise. The reflections shimmered. The movement looked alive. Dad stood behind me for a few seconds, arms crossed. "Looks like a screensaver," he said. "You know who pays for those?" "No one." He walked out before I could reply. Ethan, on the other hand, had just gotten his acceptance letter from Yale. There were balloons that day, champagne in the kitchen, relatives calling from every state. The house pulsed with pride. I stood by the counter smiling, holding the camera for family photos. When it was over, I washed the glasses and listened to Mom tell a neighbor on the phone, "Ethan's always been destined for greatness. Claire's creative, I suppose, but she'll settle somewhere stable eventually." Stable. That word stuck to me like dust on those picture frames. Thanksgiving a few years later was no different. I'd come home from college eager to share that my project had been featured in a university exhibition. I tried to tell them during dinner between the turkey and the cranberry sauce. They said my work might qualify for the innovation grant, I said. Dad nodded absently, carving another slice. "Ethan, how's that finance course? You're making connections, right?" Mom leaned in, beaming. "He just met the head of a major firm last week." The conversation veered, the spotlight snapped back to its rightful place. I fell silent. My words hung there, unfinished, like ornaments dropped from a tree. Later that night, as I was packing my bag to leave, I overheard Mom on the phone in the kitchen. "Of course Ethan will carry the Bennett legacy," she said softly. "Claire, she'll find her way eventually." I froze in the hallway. Her voice was gentle, almost loving, and that made it worse. It wasn't said with spite. It was simply the truth as she knew it. My role had already been written. That was the night something in me shifted. Not broken, just realigned. I stopped trying to win their approval. I stopped showing them my work. I stopped explaining myself. Instead, I started building in silence. Sketchbooks filled with designs. Folders of digital landscapes no one ever saw. I turned their dismissiveness into fuel. Now, standing in that same hallway years later, surrounded by gold frames that glowed under recessed lighting, I felt none of the old hurt. Only clarity. Mom appeared at the top of the stairs, elegant as ever. Her silk scarf draped just so. "Oh, Claire, you didn't need to come all this way," she said, taking the folder from my hands. "You could have mailed it." "I was nearby," I said. She smiled, that well-practiced expression of gentle civility. "Ethan just called. He's flying to London for a conference. He's doing so well. You must be proud." "I am," I said simply. She seemed relieved, as if I'd passed some invisible test. "You're such a good sister." Her words hung between us. I wondered if she even realized the irony. I turned to go, pausing one last time by the wall of photos. "Have you ever thought about adding new pictures?" I asked lightly. She blinked, confused. "Oh, I suppose we should one of these days. It's just, we've been so busy." "Right," I said. "Busy." When I stepped outside, the winter air hit my face crisp and alive. I stood on the porch, looking at the house that had once defined my worth. The windows gleamed like gold coins, cold and unreachable. Mrs. Dawson's words drifted back to me, my old art teacher, the one who'd believed in me when no one else did. "You think in systems, Claire. Don't let anyone convince you that's not valuable." And then Jake's voice from years ago, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor as we tested my first animation on his old headset. "You see things before they exist. That's a gift." Those voices had kept me alive through every quiet dismissal, every half-smile, every time my name disappeared from the conversation. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the photo gallery, and snapped a picture of the house, the perfect Bennett home, the shrine to Ethan's success. Then I zoomed in on the blank space between his frames, the sliver of wall where the light didn't quite reach. That was my space once, and soon the world would know it. I got into my car, started the engine, and whispered to myself, "They taught me silence." But they never understood that silence can build strength. The wind picked up scattering dry leaves across the driveway as I drove away, the house shrinking in the rear-view mirror. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. My revenge had already begun, not with noise, but with creation. Sunday dinners at the Bennett house always came with rules. No phones, no politics, no unnecessary arguments. But that night, I was about to break every one of them. The table was set with precision white linen, polished silver candles flickering just enough to make the room look softer than it really was. Mom loved control disguised as elegance. She hummed along to soft jazz while Dad carved the roast, Ethan bragging about his latest client deal like it was breaking news. I sat there rehearsing the words in my head, the ones that had been pressing against my ribs for weeks. When the moment came, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. I waited until the laughter died down, until the clinking of glasses faded, and then I said, "I got a grant." Dad looked up, knife midair. "A grant from the Charleston Tech Incubator." I said, trying to keep my voice even. They loved my concept for immersive design spaces. It's an AR platform, virtual environments for digital art. For a second, there was silence. Then Ethan chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that filled the space like smoke. "You mean like those VR games where people pretend to paint?" "It's not a game," I said. "It's interactive architecture. Think of it as building museums that anyone can visit from anywhere." He smirked. "Cute." Mom's fork touched the edge of her plate. "Honey, that sounds creative," she said in that tone that made everything sound like a child's drawing stuck on the fridge. "But how will it make money?" I smiled tightly. "I'll be running a company. Investors are coming on board." Ethan laughed outright. A company, Claire. You can barely keep that old Civic running. You don't even like talking to people. How are you going to pitch to investors?" The words hit like cold water, but I didn't flinch. I was used to his barbed jokes. I looked at Dad, hoping stupidly that he might see something different this time. He set the knife down carefully, folded his napkin, and sighed. "You're serious about this?" "I am," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then let me be serious too. If you walk away from a stable career path to chase this fantasy, you're on your own. No more tuition. No more allowance. No safety net." My throat tightened. "I'm not asking for money." "You will," he said flatly. "When the rent's due, when the bills come in, when reality hits. And when it does, you'll come home." Ethan leaned back, grinning. And we'll still have a place at the table for you. Right, Dad. Dad smiled faintly. Of course, once she's ready to grow up. I felt my pulse in my temples. The walls seemed smaller, the air heavier. Mom reached across the table, her hands soft, but her words sharper than any knife. Sweetheart, you have such a good heart, but you're impulsive. We just want what's safe for you. Safe. That word again. Safe meant small. Safe meant silent. Safe meant living in their shadow forever. I looked at Ethan. His eyes gleamed with amusement, certain he'd won. You'll regret this, he said. I smiled. Maybe, but at least they'll be mine to regret. The room went still. Dad's voice hardened. Don't make a scene. I'm not, I said, standing. I'm making a choice. Mom gasped softly. Claire, sit down. But I was already walking toward the door. My heels clicked against the hardwood like a metronome marking the end of a performance. I grabbed my coat from the rack. Behind me, I could hear their voices overlapping Dad's anger, Mom's worry, Ethan's laughter. When I stepped outside, the air hit me sharp and cold. For a moment, I thought I might crumble right there on the porch. But instead, I inhaled deeply and walked to my car. The night smelled like pine and ocean salt. It smelled like freedom. By midnight, I was in my apartment. 2 suitcases, 1 laptop, and a box of sketchbooks that was my life now. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in corners, but it was mine. No one's name on the lease, but mine. I opened the laptop, its fan sputtering like it was already tired. The screen flickered to life, pale blue light washing over the small kitchen table I now called my office. I created a new file, VeriVision. Concept Draft 1. VeriVision. From veritas, meaning truth. I worked until dawn. Coffee after coffee, sketch after sketch, until the first light crawled through the blinds. My ideas took shape, a network of virtual art spaces where creators could exhibit their work and anyone could step inside with a headset or phone. The coding was rough, the prototype fragile, but it was real. When the sun rose, I walked to the window and looked out over the street. A delivery truck rumbled past, a man jogged with his dog, the world already moving on without me. My family probably sat around their perfect table reliving last night's drama. To them, I was gone. A cautionary tale. But in that tiny apartment, I wasn't gone. I was beginning. The next few days blurred together, unpacking, working, emailing the incubator for next steps. They sent over legal documents, mentorship schedules, even a contact list of local investors. The kind of people my father used to drink wine with. The irony made me smile. I printed the documents and pinned them to the wall above my desk. The edges curled in the humid air, but I didn't care. It looked like progress. Still, the fear crept in at night. When the power flickered, when my bank balance blinked low, when the silence grew too big. But each morning I sat back down and opened the file again. I didn't tell anyone where I'd moved. Mom texted once, "Are you okay? Your father is worried." Ethan sent nothing. I typed back a single line, "I'm fine." Working. No one replied. One night I dreamed I was sitting at that dining table again. The same candles, the same music, the same voices mocking softly in the background. But in the dream, I didn't sit there quietly. I stood, picked up my plate, and shattered it on the floor. The sound echoed like thunder, and everyone froze. I woke up smiling. The next morning, I decided to make it official. I filed the business paperwork online, paid the small registration fee with the last of my savings, and hit submit. A confirmation email arrived seconds later. Just a few lines of text, but I stared at it like it was scripture. VeriVision LLC. Founder, Claire Bennett. That night I sat by the window again, sipping cheap instant coffee. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. For a split second, I thought it might be Mom. But it was the incubator coordinator. "Congratulations," she said. "You're officially accepted into our startup cohort. Orientation starts Monday." When the call ended, I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. Outside, the city lights flickered through the mist reflected on the glass like stars. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt capable. I thought of Ethan's smirk, Dad's disappointment, Mom's sigh. All of it replayed in my mind sharper than ever. And instead of breaking me, it hardened into something solid. They thought they'd cut me off, but what they really did was cut me free. I closed the laptop and whispered to the empty room. "You said I'd be broke forever, Ethan. Let's see how long forever lasts." The words hung in the air, a quiet vow. Then I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I meant every single one. The apartment hummed with the sound of the old refrigerator, its low rattle blending with the distant traffic outside. It was 2 a.m, and I was still awake, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of coffee and detergent. My laptop screen glowed pale blue against the cracked wall, the cursor blinking in a rhythm that matched the thump of my tired pulse. They thought cutting me off would break me. They didn't realize I'd been surviving on scraps long before that. The radiator barely worked, so I kept the oven door cracked open for warmth. A single lamp flickered on the counter beside a pile of unpaid bills and sticky notes scribbled with ideas. ForeverThen 1 read in bold marker. Rebuild the prototype. Fix frame rate lag. Add color depth. My handwriting slanted more each night as my patience wore thin. Still, I couldn't stop. When the world outside slept, I came alive. By day, I freelanced to stay afloat, designing menus for local cafes, creating logos for small boutiques, editing photos for people who thought exposure counted as payment. I didn't complain. Every invoice, no matter how small, meant rent for another week. My landlord, Mr. Ellis, knocked twice this month already, his fist heavy on the door. "You're 2 days behind again, Miss Bennett," he warned, eyes darting to the peeling paint behind me. "Try not to make it 3. The first time I apologized. The second time I just nodded. I'd stopped explaining myself to people who didn't see the fire behind the ashes. At the grocery store, I counted coins like a ritual, bread eggs, cheap coffee, ramen noodles, a small carton of milk if I was lucky. The cashier's eyes flicked to the total, then to me, and I could almost hear the judgment. "You're that girl who left her fancy family," someone whispered once in line. I didn't correct them. Let them think I was reckless, naive. It was safer that way. At night, I coded until my fingers cramped. The glow of the screen painted the room in cold light, reflecting against the hairline crack that split the plaster wall behind my desk. Every so often, I'd stare at it, tracing the uneven lines like a map. It reminded me of myself, fractured, but still holding. The first version of ForeverThen went live on Tuesday. I stayed up all night tweaking it, an interactive gallery you could walk through, and virtual space art, floating mid-air music responding to motion. When I finally clicked publish, my hands shook. I watched the little loading bar crawl to 100% and whispered, "Please." By morning, I had 12 views, 2 likes, 1 comment. Looks like a hobby project. I stared at the words until they blurred. Something inside me went hollow. For a second, I imagined Dad's voice, calm, precise, smug. "You can't build a future on fantasies." I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes, fighting the burn behind them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'd gambled everything on nothing. I thought about deleting the project, ending the whole thing before it became another failure for them to laugh about over dinner. But then I remembered something Mrs. Dawson, my old art teacher, once told me. You don't plant a tree and curse it for not blooming overnight. Her voice came back like a whisper through time. I reopened the laptop. The gallery still floated on the screen, fragile but alive. I decided not to delete it. Instead, I rebuilt it. Line by line, code by code. I worked for 3 straight days, surviving on caffeine and adrenaline. My back ached, my eyes burned, but when I finally stood up and saw what I'd created, a smoother, brighter world inside the screen, I felt something flicker back to life. Not pride. Not yet. Just a spark. Days blurred together after that. Rain leaked through the window frame, puddling near the baseboard. I placed a bucket under it and kept typing. My neighbor's music thudded through the wall every night at 11. I timed my work breaks to the rhythm of his bass. Life shrank into a loop of small rituals: code, eat, sleep, repeat. Then one Friday, I met Nora. I'd taken on a design job for her cafe, a little place on the corner called Maple and Moss, all exposed brick and hanging ferns. She was my age, but carried herself like she'd lived 3 lives already. When she looked at the logo draft on my tablet, her eyes lit up. "You made this yourself?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I build digital environments too. AR design. Still in beta." She leaned closer. "Show me." I hesitated, then pulled up ForeverThen. The lights dimmed slightly in the cafe as I projected a sample on the wall. Colors shimmered, forming a hallway of floating brushstrokes, each moving as though stirred by wind. Nora stared transfixed. "This is incredible." I laughed nervously. "It's a work in progress." "No," she said firmly. "It's art." The word hit me like a hand over my heart. A week later, she invited me to showcase the demo at her cafe's Friday art night. I almost said no. I wasn't ready. But something inside me whispered that maybe no one ever is. So I said yes. That night, string lights hung from the ceiling, music floated from a small speaker, and people filled the room with chatter and clinking glasses. My laptop sat on a small table near the back, cables running to a portable projector. My palms were slick with sweat as I adjusted the settings. When the first scene appeared, the digital forest bathed in soft gold light, the room went quiet. A little boy near the counter gasped. "It feels like magic," he whispered. Those 4 words undid me. For months I'd been surrounded by silence that only judged. For the first time, silence meant awe. People came up after asking how it worked, if they could try it. I explained as best I could, my voice shaking but alive. Nora hugged me before the night ended. "You have something special," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." When I walked home, my steps felt lighter. The cold didn't bite as hard. Back in my apartment, I sat on the floor watching the light from the street lamps crawl up the cracked wall. I thought of that night at my parents' table. Ethan's smirk, Dad's warning, Mom's pity. All those polished faces telling me I'd fail. Maybe I still would, but at least I'd fail on my own terms. I reached for a pen and tore a page from my notebook. In the center, I wrote 5 words. "Silence is not surrender." I taped it above my desk, right where the plaster split a line running straight through the middle of the message like an underline carved by time. My phone buzzed with a notification. An email. Subject: Startup Fair. Phoenix Tech Expo open applications now. I read it twice. My heart thudded once hard. The deadline was 3 days away. I stared at the cursor blinking on the screen, that small pulse of possibility. The apartment was still the world outside asleep, but something inside me had already awakened. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was hope. Either way, I wasn't going to let it fade. I opened a new tab and began to type. Name: Claire Bennett. Company: ForeverThen. When I hit submit, the laptop hummed softly as if exhaling. I leaned back in my chair, eyes tracing the cracks in the wall that looked almost like veins alive and reaching. They'd called me foolish once, but if foolishness built empires, then maybe I was exactly what I was meant to be. The email came early on a Monday morning, right as I was pouring the last of my instant coffee into a chipped mug. The subject line was short. Almost cold: "Congratulations, you've been selected to present at the Phoenix Tech Expo." For a second, I just stared at it. Then I reread it. Twice. My hands trembled so badly that I nearly spilled the coffee. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by peeling paint and the hum of the old refrigerator, and whispered, "They actually picked me." The rain tapped softly against the window, a steady rhythm, like applause from the universe. I printed the confirmation email, even though I didn't own a printer that worked properly. It sputtered, coughed, and spat out the wrinkled paper. I pinned it to the wall right next to the note that had kept me alive for weeks: "Silence is not surrender." It wasn't luck. It was the consequence of every sleepless night, Every insult, every quiet moment they thought I was wasting my life. I was terrified, but underneath the fear was something hotter, steadier anticipation. For the next few days, my apartment became a war zone. Nora brought over boxes of supplies, scraps of fabric paints, cardboard from her cafe's deliveries. I used them all. The other applicants would show up with glossy banners and corporate booths. I had a folding table Nora loaned me and a dream held together by duct tape. I designed my own display with recycled foam boards and printed logos at the public library for 50 cents a page. I used black thread to hang my ForeverThen mock-ups against the wall, the letters uneven but bold. When I finished, it looked nothing like the sleek showcases I'd seen online. It looked alive, imperfect mine. At night, I practiced my pitch in front of the cracked mirror. I hated hearing my own voice at first, but Nora made me keep going. She sat on my couch with a cup of tea and said, "You keep trying to sound like them. Don't talk like you." "I'll sound nervous," I said. "Good," she replied. People are nervous before they believe they are perfect. I stayed up until dawn the night before the expo rewriting my pitch one last time. Every line had to mean something. Every sentence had to prove I deserved to be there. As the first light crept through the blinds, I packed everything into 2 boxes and whispered to my reflection. They said I'd be broke forever. Let's see how long forever lasts. The Phoenix Tech Expo was held in downtown Atlanta inside a convention hall so bright it looked sterilized. Rows of booths stretched like a city grid LED screens, neon signage, clean-cut entrepreneurs in tailored suits. Everyone looked like they belonged. I didn't. My booth was near the back next to a startup selling 3D printed jewelry and a group of college students demonstrating drone delivery tech. They had matching polo shirts and a sponsor banner. I had a thrift store blazer in trembling hands. By noon, hundreds of people had passed me by. Some slowed down just long enough to smirk politely before moving on. One man wearing a badge that read Angel Investor leaned in to glance at my screen. "Virtual art galleries," he said. "Interesting hobby." "It's not a hobby," I said, steadying my voice. "It's a scalable AR platform for immersive environments." He cut me off with a thin smile. "That's cute. You should talk to marketing startups, not venture capital." Then he walked away. Cute. That word again. Another investor tried my demo, a sleek guy with perfect hair and a Rolex flashing under the lights. He put on the headset, explored for less than a minute, then took it off. "Visually nice," he said. "But how do you monetize it? Art doesn't sell anymore." "Experiences do." "I'm building experiences," I said, but he was already gone. The air around me felt heavier. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, buzzing in my ears. For a moment I thought about packing up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here any more than I belonged at my parents' table. I turned toward my booth and saw the cracked corner of my old laptop screen. For a second, the reflection caught my face, tired, uncertain, but still standing. That was enough to keep me from leaving. Hours passed. The crowd thinned. My throat burned from talking. My voice trembled with exhaustion. Then around 4 p.m, she appeared. A woman in a navy suit. Silver hair swept back neatly, eyes sharp but kind. She didn't carry a clipboard or a camera crew. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way powerful people do when they're used to being noticed without trying. She stopped at my booth and looked at the sign taped crookedly above my screen. ForeverThen, she read aloud. Her voice was smooth, controlled. "What's this about?" I swallowed hard. "It's an augmented reality platform that builds virtual spaces for artists, interactive environments where people can explore digital art, architecture, and sound. It's about bringing creativity back into accessibility." She nodded once, wordless, and reached for the headset. For nearly 3 minutes, she said nothing. She walked through my virtual gallery, the light filters, the floating sculptures, the soft hum of music I'd spent nights perfecting. When she finally took the headset off, her expression was unreadable. Then she said 3 words that knocked the air out of me. How much I blinked. "I'm sorry, I want to buy it," she said simply. "The full installation." Name your price." My mind scrambled. I hadn't even thought about selling it yet. 200,000? I said, the number slipping out before I could stop it. Her lips curved into a small smile. "Send me the paperwork." I stared. "You're serious?" "Very," she said, extending her hand. "Margaret Dawson, Dawson Ventures." Her handshake was firm, warm, steady. My own hand trembled, but I didn't look away. "I'll have my assistant reach out by the end of the day," she said, and turned to leave. I stood frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd. Nora ran over from the booth next to mine, eyes wide. Did that actually happen?" I nodded slowly, still trying to breathe. "I think it did." By the end of the day, my inbox pinged. The email subject line was simple. Contract attached. VeraVision acquisition. $200,000. When the hall finally emptied, I sat in my car in the underground parking lot. The air was cool, still humming with the echo of footsteps above. I looked down at my hands, palms still tingling from that handshake. I could still feel the texture of her skin, calm, unshaken, certain. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post about it. This moment wasn't for the world, and it definitely wasn't for them. It was mine. I thought about my family, then Ethan's smug grin, Dad's dismissal, Mom's polite disappointment. I imagined their laughter turning into silence when they found out. The idea of it made me exhale slowly, like releasing years of weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Outside, the city lights flickered in the rain. People walked past my car talking about profits, partnerships, IPOs. None of them knew that in one corner of the building, a girl they wouldn't have bothered to notice had just changed the trajectory of her life. I glanced at my phone again at the line of text confirming the wire transfer schedule. $200,000. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was what it represented: proof. Proof that I wasn't foolish, that I wasn't broken, that my silence had been a strategy, not surrender. I leaned back, closing my eyes. The faint hum of the engine mixed with the steady beat of my heart. "This isn't revenge yet," I whispered to myself. "It's preparation." Then I started the car, the headlights cutting through the mist. The rain had stopped, but the road still gleamed like the world itself was reflecting me back. As I pulled onto the highway, my phone buzzed. A message from Nora lit up the screen. "You realize this could go viral, right?" I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from the deep center of your chest. "Let it," I said, and pressed the accelerator. They said I'd be broke forever. But forever had just ended. The call came just after sunrise. I was still half asleep, the light soft against my cracked blinds, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The number was unknown Atlanta area code. For a second I thought it might be a scam, but something in me said to answer. "Miss Bennett." The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Claire from Dawson Ventures. Mrs. Dawson asked me to confirm that the transfer has been completed and to schedule your first meeting." I sat up too fast, my heart thudding. "The transfer?" "Yes," she said with a smile in her tone. 200,000. You should see it in your account within the hour. Mrs. Dawson is very impressed. She'd like to discuss next steps this afternoon if you're available." I could barely find my words. "Yes, of course. I'll be there." When the call ended, I stared at the ceiling, stunned. Then I opened my laptop, logged into my bank, and there it was, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. The number glowed back at me like something holy. For the first time, I didn't have to ask permission to exist. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing against the empty walls. Then I stood, grabbed my notebook, and drew a circle around the words I'd written weeks ago. Silence is not surrender. It felt different now, less like comfort, more like prophecy. The meeting was scheduled for 3 that afternoon. I left early, taking the long drive from Savannah to Atlanta with the windows down, the spring air cutting through the remnants of winter. The skyline rose ahead of me, sharp and silver, a city built by people who refused to stay small. I whispered to myself, "You belong here." Dawson Ventures sat in a glass building that looked like it could hold clouds. Inside, everything gleamed: white marble floors, tall windows, quiet power in every line of design. The receptionist smiled and led me to a conference room on the 24th floor. My reflection followed me in the glass walls, and for a moment I barely recognized her, the girl who once counted coins for groceries, now wearing confidence like armor. Then the door opened and she walked in. Mrs. Dawson looked exactly as I remembered her from the expo. Graceful, composed, the kind of woman who could silence a room without raising her voice. Her navy suit was immaculate, her silver hair swept into a low chignon. She extended her hand and I noticed she didn't wear much jewelry, just a simple watch. "Claire," she said warmly, "I'm glad you came. Thank you for believing in what I'm building." Her smile was subtle. "I didn't invest in belief, dear. I invested in vision. There's a difference." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. Let's talk." For the next hour, she asked questions not just about the technology, but about me. Why I built ForeverThen, what I wanted it to mean, what I was willing to sacrifice. "What are you building, Claire?" she asked finally, leaning back. "A business or a legacy?" The question hung between us. "I'm building what they said I couldn't," I said. "Maybe that's both." Her eyes softened. "Good answer. Anger fades. Vision lasts." No one had ever spoken to me that way. Not like a charity case. Not like a girl chasing a dream too big for her hands. She treated me as an equal, maybe even as a reflection of something she used to be. She outlined what came next: mentorship sessions, legal advisors, introductions to investors. I tried to write everything down, but halfway through she stopped me. "Don't take notes," she said. "Listen. You'll remember what matters." When the meeting ended, she stood and offered a firm handshake. "You have a fire that reminds me of myself at your age. But remember, success won't protect you. It will only expose who's afraid of you." That line stayed with me long after I left. Weeks passed, and under her guidance, my world began to shift. ForeverThen wasn't just an idea anymore, it was becoming a company. Dawson introduced me to a lawyer named Collins, who helped me file trademarks and negotiate vendor contracts. She invited me to quiet breakfasts at her favorite corner cafe where we discussed strategy over black coffee and scones. She never wasted words. When I asked about marketing, she said, "Let the work speak first. Hype fades, results don't." When I doubted myself, she reminded me, "You can't control their opinion, only your consistency." I started waking up earlier, staying up later, living in the rhythm of momentum. Nora joined me full-time, managing design outreach and partnerships. We built a small team of freelancers, coders, 3D artists, and a social strategist. The apartment that once felt suffocating now buzzed with life. Pizza boxes, coffee cups, sticky notes on every wall. One night after a 16-hour day, I sat at my desk, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen: contracts, budgets, investor inquiries. It all felt unreal. Just 6 months ago, I was scraping coins for rent. Now I was managing invoices worth more than my father's yearly salary. Sometimes I thought about calling them to say, "Look, I did it." But I didn't. They hadn't earned the right to hear it from me. Not yet. Mrs. Dawson invited me to her private gallery in the city one evening. "Come," she said on the phone. "I want to show you something." The space was quiet, filled with sculptures and paintings collected from artists she'd supported over the years. It wasn't grand or flashy, just beautiful in its restraint. She handed me a glass of wine and we walked among the pieces. "You remind me of one of them," she said, stopping before a bronze sculpture of a woman breaking out of a shell. "I bought this when I was your age. I was just starting my own company then." The men around me laughed. They told me to go home and bake cookies. So I built an empire instead. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I wish I'd met you sooner." She looked at me, eyes sharp with warmth. "You wouldn't have listened sooner. You had to get hungry first." We clinked glasses. The sound rang clear in the quiet room. As the night wore on, we sat in front of a window overlooking the skyline. The city pulsed below like a living thing. Mrs. Dawson's tone shifted, softer but more deliberate. "Be careful with your family, Claire. They'll come back not because they've changed, but because you have. And when they do remember who left first. I didn't answer right away. I just watched the lights flicker across the glass, thinking of Ethan's smirk, Dad's voice, Mom's careful silence. "I'm not planning revenge," I said finally. "Not the kind they'd expect." Mrs. Dawson tilted her head. "No, I'm planning exposure," I said quietly. They built their pride on pretending I'd failed. "I'm going to let the truth speak for itself." She smiled slow and knowing. "Then let's make sure the truth is impossible to ignore." When I left the gallery that night, the air was cool and the city was humming. I stopped by the large mirrored wall near the exit. My reflection multiplied infinitely, one version of me after another, stretching into forever. The girl who once sat at a dinner table full of mockery was still there somewhere small but fierce. The woman standing here was her answer. They taught me to disappear. Now I was learning how to make them watch. The text came in just after midnight. "Call me. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time, the glow of the message lighting the quiet dark of my apartment. It was from my mother. Her words looked polite enough, but I could hear the tone beneath them, the soft rehearsed urgency. That wasn't love, but curiosity. Someone must have said my name somewhere that mattered. I didn't call back. I placed the phone face down and opened my laptop instead. The hum of the screen filled the silence steady and familiar. I wasn't the same woman who used to wait by the phone for their approval. I had built a world so wide now that I didn't need their voices in it. They spent years pretending I didn't exist. Now my silence was the only thing they could hear. ForeverThen had grown faster than I could keep up. After Mrs. Dawson's investment, everything shifted. The prototype became a platform. The small team Nora and I had scraped together turned into a company designers, coders, consultants from places I'd only read about before. Our beta launch had been quiet, almost shy until one morning a journalist from an online art magazine posted a feature titled "The Woman Redefining Virtual Space." Within days, the numbers exploded. Downloads, mentions, emails, invitations. My inbox became a storm of praise and proposals. Museums wanted virtual installations. Schools wanted partnerships. Investors wanted meetings. And still I said no to most of them. "Don't you want the exposure?" Nora asked, once scrolling through a list of unread requests. "Exposure doesn't pay rent," I said, smiling faintly. "Let the numbers speak for now. Words can wait." We celebrated in small ways. A pizza on the office floor, cheap wine in paper cups. The space we rented had huge windows facing the ocean. The sunlight spilled in like gold every morning, stretching across the desks, reminding me of how far light could travel once it escaped its box. I kept thinking about the house I grew up in, how dark it always felt, even with the chandeliers. I wondered if they'd seen the news yet. They had. One evening, hundreds of miles away in Charleston, the Bennetts hosted one of their usual dinner parties. The house glimmered with its usual perfection, white roses, gold-trimmed china, polite laughter echoing against marble floors. Ethan was holding court at the head of the table, boasting about his promotion at the firm. Dad raised his glass. To my son, he said, pride swelling in his voice. The one carrying the Bennett legacy. Mom smiled, her pearls catching the candlelight. The guests murmured their admiration. And then a man at the far end of the table, a client of Dad's, spoke casually. "I read about Bennett in Forbes last week. A woman from Georgia. Founded some virtual art company. What was it called? ForeverThen?" The room fell still. "Any relation?" the man asked, pouring himself more wine. "Seems she's quite the phenomenon." Ethan laughed too quickly. "Coincidence. Probably another Bennett." Dad nodded stiffly, but his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. Mom said nothing. Her eyes flicked toward the wall where family portraits hung, Ethan's graduation, Ethan's awards, Ethan's wedding photos. No Claire. That night when the guests were gone, she sat at her vanity with her phone typing my name into a search bar. My face appeared instantly on magazine covers, tech articles, interviews I hadn't even agreed to. She scrolled through photos of me in black suits and simple jewelry, shaking hands with people she'd once begged to meet. Each image felt like a confession. "Oh my God," she whispered. It wasn't pride. It was disbelief. Maybe even fear. While she sat in silence, I was in my office, barefoot hair tied back, sketching new layout concepts for our museum partnerships. I didn't know what was happening in Charleston, and even if I had, I wouldn't have cared. ForeverThen had become bigger than my past. We expanded to 3 continents within months. Articles labeled me the quiet disruptor. Mrs. Dawson called it poetic justice. I called it peace. I refused interviews. I didn't post photos. I didn't announce new deals. But people noticed anyway. They always do when the work speaks louder than the noise. They once taught me silence was weakness, I told Nora one night after a long day. But silence is strategy. Silence makes people lean in to hear you. She smiled. And what will you say when they finally listen? Nothing, I said. Just let them choke on their assumptions. The next morning, Mrs. Dawson called to tell me I'd been nominated for the Women in Tech Leadership Award. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure I wanted it. Why not, she asked. Because I didn't build this for applause, I said. She laughed softly. You'll learn, Claire. Recognition isn't applause, it's power. Maybe she was right. The following weeks blurred together. ForeverThen hit global headlines. Our designs were featured in London, Tokyo, Berlin. Still, I kept my life small, same apartment, same car, same quiet routines. Freedom, I'd learned, didn't need flash. One afternoon, I bought a new office space, a glass-fronted studio overlooking the ocean. The realtor asked if I wanted to tour the penthouse level. I shook my head. No, I said. This will do. Because it wasn't about climbing higher anymore. It was about standing firm where they said I'd fall. That night I went home and found a voicemail waiting. The number was familiar. Hey, Claire. Ethan's voice began hesitant and smooth. Listen, I heard something about you being in Forbes. Mom and Dad didn't tell me you were doing so well. That's amazing. Really. Maybe we could catch up sometime, talk about collaborating or something. Family should support each other, right? His tone was sugar over venom. I could almost hear the smugness beneath the sudden politeness. I didn't replay it. I just deleted it. Funny, I said to the empty room, how the word collaborate sounds like collect. The next morning, an email came through from an event coordinator. The subject line made me pause. Invitation, Charleston Business Awards. Gala sponsored by Bennett Holdings. My father's firm. I stared at the screen, my reflection staring back at me in the glass. The irony was almost cinematic. They'd spent years scrubbing my name out of every family introduction, every Christmas card, every conversation. And now their company was hosting an event they didn't realize I was about to attend as the keynote guest their sponsors had specifically requested. For a moment, I just sat there, the hum of the laptop filling the silence. Then I smiled. They wanted me gone from their table. Now they were setting one I would own. I circled the date on my calendar in red ink and leaned back in my chair. The ocean outside glittered beneath the late afternoon sun, waves rolling toward the shore with quiet certainty. My revenge didn't need to shout. It just needed to arrive on time. The envelope was thick, elegant, and heavy enough to feel deliberate. I found it waiting on my desk one morning, delivered by courier. The embossed letters gleamed under the sunlight, Bennett Holdings. For a moment, I just stared at it, my fingers tracing the gold seal I'd seen on 1,000 letterheads, growing up the symbol of everything that once made me feel small. Inside was a gold-trimmed invitation. You are cordially invited to the Charleston Business Awards Gala, honoring the most influential entrepreneurs of the South. My name sat in bold type near the center. Beneath it, in ink that wasn't printed but written by hand, were 4 words that made me smile without meaning to. We hope you'll attend. R. Bennett. My father had signed it himself. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights spilling across the document. The same man who once told me I'd walk away from support was now asking for my presence at his event. I read the note again and whispered to the empty office. You wanted a guest of honor, Dad. You just didn't expect it to be me." Nora walked in with a coffee and froze when she saw the letter. "Is that an invitation?" I said, slipping it back into the envelope. "To the empire that once erased me." "You're going?" she asked carefully. "Yes," I said. "Not to reconcile. To remind you." I spent the next week preparing not for spectacle but for precision. I didn't hire a stylist or a driver. I didn't rent a mansion suite or rehearse a speech. I chose a single navy satin gown, understated but striking. It reminded me of Mrs. Dawson Power disguised as calm. I tied my hair back, left my jewelry simple, and stood before the mirror. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the fragile girl who had fled Charleston with 2 suitcases. This version was composed, deliberate. The quiet inside her wasn't emptiness anymore. It was a strategy. Nora helped zip up the dress and stepped back, smiling. "You look like closure." I laughed softly. "That's exactly the point." Before leaving, I looked around my office, clean lines, warm light, the hum of progress in every corner. My company, my creation. I didn't plan to bring business cards or samples to the gala. My presence would be enough. The drive to Charleston felt surreal. The same roads that once carried me away now seemed smaller, harmless even. The city had changed in subtle ways. Sleeker storefronts, new cafes, but the humidity and scent of salt air felt the same. I drove past the old neighborhood, the sprawling oaks, the narrow cobblestone streets where I'd once walked invisible. When I reached my parents' street, I slowed. The house stood just as I remembered it, grand, symmetrical, shining like a museum of someone else's success. Through the large bay windows, I saw silhouettes moving inside glasses, raised laughter floating out like background noise to a play I no longer belonged to. I didn't stop. I pressed my foot to the gas and kept driving until the mansion disappeared behind me. I checked into a hotel by the waterfront, the same one my father used to reserve for clients, where I'd once been told to stay out of sight during networking dinners. The concierge greeted me with a bright smile. "Welcome back to Charleston, Ms. Bennett. We've been expecting you." For a moment, the words hit me harder than I expected. "We've been expecting you." That night, I stood on the balcony looking out at the harbor lights, the scent of jasmine drifting on the air. Coming back didn't sting like I thought it would. It just confirmed how far I'd gone. The next evening, the gala glimmered beneath chandeliers at the Charleston Grand Hotel. Black suits, floor-length gowns, champagne and laughter polished to perfection. Every detail screamed the same thing: status. I walked through the entrance alone. Cameras flashed instantly, the air shifting as my name moved through the crowd like static. "Is that her?" someone whispered. "That's Claire Bennett. ForeverThen." I caught a glimpse of my parents across the ballroom. My mother's eyes widened, first recognition blooming into disbelief. She clutched her glass tighter, her lips parting as if to say my name, but no sound came. My father followed her gaze, his posture stiffening before he pasted on a practiced smile. Ethan's expression was the most satisfying shock, turning to confusion, then dread. I didn't approach them. "Not yet." The announcer's voice echoed over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight's special honorees, leaders who've shaped innovation across the South. Among them, Charleston's own Ms. Claire Bennett, founder and CEO of ForeverThen." The applause came in waves. Cameras turned. Spotlights shifted. I stepped forward, calm, measured my heels clicking against the marble floor. The sound was sharp enough to slice through every whispered memory of mockery. When I reached the stage, I didn't look at my family. I looked at the audience. The very people who'd once dismissed me were now on their feet, clapping, smiling, wanting a piece of what they'd never believed in. "Thank you," I said simply, when handed the microphone. My voice didn't shake. "I'm honored to be here tonight in the city where I learned that silence can build more than noise ever could." That was all. No speech, no theatrics, just the truth. The kind that cuts quietly. After the ceremony, I made my way toward the exit, but the inevitable happened. "Claire." My father's voice came from behind me. I turned slowly. He was smiling too wide, the kind of smile that hides panic. You look incredible. We're proud of you. I tilted my head slightly. That's good to hear. It took a while. Mom stepped in, her eyes glossy, voice trembling. Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped, supported. You wouldn't have listened, I said softly. Ethan forced a laugh, trying to bridge the tension. We were just talking about how the Bennett legacy keeps expanding. Maybe we could partner somehow, merge your innovation with our firm's resources, keep it in the family. There it was. No remorse. Opportunism. I let a heartbeat pass before I answered. I'm not expanding into family-owned businesses. The silence that followed was exquisite. Mom's hand dropped. Ethan's smile faltered. Dad's face reddened under the chandelier light. Claire, he said tightly, we're still your family. Yes, I said. That's what makes this easier. I turned to leave but then paused, glancing back once more, not out of cruelty, but closure. You were right about one thing, Dad. You said walking away meant walking away from support. I guess I learned to build my own. And with that, I walked away, the train of my gown brushing across marble like the whisper of a closing door. Outside, the air was cooler. The night was quiet except for the sound of distant music fading behind me. I stood beneath the hotel canopy, breathing in the salt breeze, the lights of the harbor shimmering like a promise kept. Reporters waited nearby, cameras poised. One stepped forward. Ms. Bennett, what's next for VeraVision? I smiled faintly, the same calm curve I'd worn all night. Expansion, I said. Then I slipped into the waiting car, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt like the punctuation on years of silence. Inside, I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the evening settle. My reflection in the window met my gaze, steady, unafraid, utterly free. They had wanted me gone from their table. Now they were just trying to find a seat for me. The letter came on cream stationery, written in my mother's careful cursive. Come to dinner Sunday. Let's start over. Please. The words were soft, almost pleading, but I could hear the desperation between the lines. It wasn't love calling me home. It was pride, bruised and frightened, trying to disguise itself as concern. I held the note for a while, tracing the handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My instinct said to ignore it, but another part of me, the one that had waited a lifetime for quiet resolution, whispered go. Not to forgive, to finish. Sunday arrived cool and clear. I drove to Charleston with no music playing, just the hum of the road and the rhythmic beat of my pulse. When I turned into the long driveway, the mansion looked exactly the same, columns, proud windows glowing gold, every light on like a warning. But I didn't feel small this time. The house felt smaller instead, as if my memories had outgrown it. Mom opened the door before I could knock. Her smile trembled. You came. I said I would, I replied. The air smelled like lemon polish and roasted chicken, a familiar combination that made my stomach tighten. Dad appeared from the hallway, his expression carefully neutral, the kind he wore during tense board meetings. Claire, he said, voice steady but strained. You look well. Ethan came next, grinning too wide, his arm around a wife I'd never met. Long time, sis. You've been busy. Busy. That word again, like my success was just a hobby that got out of hand. The dining table gleamed under the chandelier. Every fork, knife, and crystal glass was lined up as perfectly as it had been during those old dinners. The ones where silence was punishment and laughter was weaponized. I took my seat at the far end opposite my father. It was the same chair I'd sat in the night he told me I'd be broke forever. The memory flickered like static. Mom poured the wine herself, her bracelets clinking. I'm glad you came, darling. We've all been so proud of you. Forbes, the interviews, the company. My God, it's incredible. I smiled slightly. Thank you. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You really pulled it off, huh? I've been telling people how you always had this creative streak. Guess it finally paid off. Guess so, I said, my tone even. Dad cleared his throat. We may have been overly critical in the past, but we only pushed you because we wanted you to have stability. There it was. The rewriting of history. The soft varnish they used to paint over every ugly truth. Stability, I repeated. That's one word for it. Mom's eyes flickered, but she pressed on. We just didn't understand what you were doing, sweetheart. Technology art. It all sounded so risky. We thought you'd get hurt. You mean fail, I said. The room fell quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier above us. Ethan jumped in, desperate to fill the silence. Come on, Claire. Let's not do this. We're all here to reconnect. Maybe even talk about business. He smiled, oily and confident. We could integrate VeraVision's design tools into Bennett Holdings. The market's moving digital, and you're leading the way. It makes sense. Mom nodded eagerly. It could be a family venture. Full circle. I set my fork down gently, the silver clinking against the plate. You only remember family when it benefits you. Dad's jaw tightened. That's not fair. No, I said quietly. It's not. For a long moment, no one spoke. The smell of roasted herbs filled the silence, heavy and suffocating. I looked around the table at the people who once dictated my worth and realized how little they'd changed. They were still performing, still desperate to control the story. This isn't dinner, I said softly. It's theater. Mom blinked, hurt flickering across her face. We just want to understand you, Claire. You had years to do that, I said. You chose not to. Ethan sighed dramatically. Look, we made mistakes, all right. But you don't have to keep punishing everyone. You won. Isn't that enough? I met his gaze. This was never about winning. It was about surviving. The words landed like a stone. No one moved. Dad finally spoke, his voice low-clipped. We've done what we thought was best for you. You might not agree, but everything we did, everything came from love. I leaned forward slightly. When you cut me off, was that love? When you laughed at my choices, called them foolish, told me I'd come crawling back, was that love too? His face hardened. You're twisting things. No, I said. I'm remembering them. Mom's voice broke. We're your parents. We can't undo the past, but we want to be part of your future. I studied her face, the same pleading softness that had once made me fold 100 times before, but this time I didn't bend. You want access, I said evenly. Not connection. Tears welled in her eyes. That's not true. Isn't it? I asked. Because the moment I stopped being useful to your image, you forgot I existed. Ethan pushed back his chair, frustrated. God, you're impossible. You think you're better than all of us now? I shook my head slowly. No, I just stopped needing you to tell me who I am. The silence that followed was sharp, almost holy. For the first time, they didn't have a line prepared. Mom reached across the table, her hand trembling. Can't we just move on? I looked at her, at the fine lines around her eyes, at the desperation to smooth years of cruelty with one evening of civility. Moving on doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means I go forward and you stay where you are. Dad's voice rose slightly, his control cracking. You're still Bennett whether you like it or not. I stood slowly, my napkin falling to the table. You're right, I said. I am the part that survived it. I thanked them politely for the meal and walked toward the door. Behind me I heard chairs scraping, murmured arguments, the clatter of silverware, but I didn't turn around. Outside the air was crisp, cool against my skin. I exhaled deeply, the tension dissolving with every breath. My car sat under the soft glow of the driveway lights, the same path I'd driven away from years ago. Back then I'd left broken and invisible. Tonight, I left untouchable. My phone buzzed as I slid into the driver's seat. It was a message from Mrs. Dawson. Ready for the next move, I smiled, my reflection glowing faintly in the rearview mirror. Always, I typed back. As I drove away, the mansion grew smaller in the distance, just another relic of who I used to be. The silence inside the car felt good, clean-earned. Some revenge doesn't need fire. Sometimes it's enough to let the truth sit with them at the table and watch them choke on it. The sunlight woke me before the alarm did. It streamed through the glass walls of my apartment, turning the ocean outside into gold. I didn't sleep much after dinner. The words, the looks, the silence, all of it had replayed behind my eyes like an old film. But this morning felt different. The air was lighter, the kind that carries endings. My phone buzzed from the nightstand, vibrating like a heartbeat that refused to rest. Dozens of notifications, emails, messages, tags. I rubbed my eyes and opened one at random. Forbes global feature, "The Future of Art Belongs to ForeverThen." My photo filled the screen. I was standing at the gala, mid-smile, the chandelier's light catching my hair. Beneath it, the headline pulsed like it was alive. Every major outlet had picked it up: Bloomberg, CNBC, even BBC World. Someone had recorded my short acceptance speech, and it had gone viral overnight. I scrolled slowly, reading comments I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago. A woman changing the landscape of virtual design. Proof that patience can be power. Claire Bennett, the quiet visionary. I laughed softly. Quiet. That word had once been my curse. Now it was my crown. I set the phone down and went to the window, watching the waves roll in. The reflection that stared back wasn't just a woman who'd made it. It was one who'd made peace with what it cost. Then the phone rang again. "Mrs. Dawson." "Congratulations," she said, her voice warm with pride. "You didn't just build a company, Claire. You built a movement." I smiled. "It doesn't feel real yet." "It will," she replied. The world finally caught up to what I saw years ago. When the call ended, I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the salt air. It was strange how success didn't feel loud. It felt calm, like the sea after a storm. By noon, the world had gone mad for ForeverThen. Hashtags trended. Stock prices climbed. Investors I'd never met sent congratulations. Our servers crashed under the weight of new users. My inbox flooded with interview requests and press inquiries. But the messages that mattered most came from strangers. Women. "I left my job after watching your story. You gave me the courage to start my own business at 55. You reminded me that being underestimated isn't the end, it's the beginning." I read every one of them until my eyes blurred. These women weren't just thanking me, they were reclaiming themselves. My silence had somehow given them permission to speak. That evening, as the city lights began to glow, my phone rang again. This time I didn't recognize the number, but I knew who it was before I answered. "Claire," my father said. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We saw the news. Your mother's been crying all morning." I leaned against the window, watching the reflection of the sunset ripple across the glass. "I'm sure she has. You've done well. I want you to know that," he continued. Maybe I was too hard on you. Maybe I said." He hesitated. "We'd like to meet. Talk about how we can—" I ended the call before he finished. For years I'd chased their approval like oxygen. Now I realized I didn't need to breathe their air anymore. The next day, Mrs. Dawson called again. "They want you on the Morning View show. National broadcast. Primetime. I think you should do it." I hesitated. "You know I don't like the spotlight." "You don't have to like it," she said gently. "You just have to understand what it means. You're not speaking for them, you're speaking for the ones who can't." She was right. 2 days later, I sat under the studio lights, facing a host with perfect hair and practiced warmth. Cameras rolled. The world watched. Claire Bennett, the host, said, "You've been called the quiet visionary, the woman who changed the future of immersive art." "What's your secret?" I smiled, slow and steady. "There's no secret. Just persistence. When they doubted me, I worked. When they mocked me, I learned. Success isn't revenge, it's clarity." The audience was silent for a moment, then burst into applause. I saw the host's smile widen, the producer signaling to the camera. I wasn't performing. I was simply telling the truth. Later, the clip flooded the internet. My words, offhand honest, became a quote shared across every platform. "The sweetest revenge is being undeniable." For the first time in my life, people were listening, not because they pitied me, but because they respected me. and that I realized was the purest kind of justice. Weeks passed like soft waves against the shore. ForeverThen expanded faster than I could track partnerships with global museums, universities, creative hubs from London to Seoul. Nora handled most of the press, now her sharp mind and quick wit balancing my quiet focus. One afternoon, she burst into my office with her laptop in hand. "Claire," she said, grinning, "the Louvre just signed the deal. Paris wants ForeverThen." I stared at the screen, the words swimming in front of me. "Paris," I repeated, almost whispering. She nodded. "You did it." I corrected her gently. "We did it." When she left, I walked to the window again, the ocean stretching endlessly before me. It wasn't Charleston's confined waters anymore. It was open, infinite. The phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would be, someone from my past reaching toward the light I'd built without them. I turned the phone face down on the desk. Instead, I opened my leather journal, the one I'd kept since the beginning, where pages still smelled faintly of coffee and exhaustion. I flipped past sketches of early prototypes, half-formed ideas, and scrawled frustration until I reached a blank page. Then I wrote slowly and clearly, "Peace is louder than revenge." I sat back watching the ink dry, the letters sinking into the paper like truth finding its place. Outside, the ocean shimmered endless and alive. I stepped onto the balcony, the wind cool against my skin. The city behind me buzzed with noise and motion, but here the only sound was the rhythm of waves. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing anything, not love, not approval, not even victory. I was simply free. Somewhere in Charleston, I imagined the chandelier still glowing, the dinner table still set, the silence still heavy. Let it stay that way. My story no longer belonged in that house. It belonged here, in light and movement, in the quiet that was finally mine. They said I'd be broke forever. Now I knew what I'd built was never just wealth. It was worth. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that felt too quiet to carry news. It was cream-colored thick, with my name embossed in gold. When I turned it over, I recognized the seal instantly, the Charleston Chamber of Commerce. I ran my thumb over the raised lettering, half expecting it to vanish like some trick of memory. Inside the letter was written in careful formal prose, "You are cordially invited to the Charleston City Innovators Award Gala, celebrating individuals who have contributed to the growth and creativity of our community." My name was printed in bold beneath it. At the bottom, in smaller print, were the words I hadn't expected to see again, sponsored in part by Bennett Holdings. I laughed soft, incredulous. The same family business that had once cut me off now had its name quietly attached to my success. I set the letter beside my framed Forbes feature, the one that had gone viral weeks before. The symmetry of it all made me smile. "They spent years pretending I wasn't theirs," I murmured. "Now they can't tell my story without my name." This invitation wasn't revenge. It was ironic. Still, I decided to go. Not for them, not for Charleston, but for the younger version of me who once stared out a bedroom window in this city and wondered if she'd ever be seen. The night of the gala, I dressed in white, a clean slate. The fabric caught the light when I moved, simple and graceful. No diamonds, no borrowed prestige. Just clarity. Nora helped zip the back and stepped away to admire. "You look like peace," she said. "That's the goal," I replied. We laughed softly, the sound familiar and grounding. Before leaving, I pulled an old photo album from my shelf. The pages smelled faintly of dust and lost time. There I was, a little girl with tangled hair holding a sketchbook too big for her lap. A teenager sitting at a dinner table, eyes down, while my brother took the spotlight. A young woman invisible even in family portraits. I tore out one photo, folded it once, and slipped it into the trash. Not out of anger, out of release. "Forgiveness isn't for them," I whispered. "It's for me, so I can stop carrying what they dropped." Charleston glimmered that night, all soft gold and magnolia-scented air. The Civic Hall was draped in white lights, the kind meant to make people feel important. As I stepped out of the car, cameras flashed. My name rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. Claire Bennett. Over here? I smiled politely, pausing for one photo before walking inside. The marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers. I caught my reflection in a glass wall composed calm. No trace of the trembling girl who had once fled this city with everything she owned in 2 suitcases. The mayor spoke first, reading from a teleprompter about innovation leadership and community pride. Then my name. Our next honoree, he said, has redefined how art and technology intertwine. A Charleston native whose work is now shaping global culture. Please welcome Ms. Claire Bennett. Applause filled the hall. I walked toward the stage, the sound washing over me, familiar, but finely earned. In the front row, I saw them, my parents and Ethan. Mom's eyes glistened. Dad sat upright, face composed but rigid. Ethan clapped without enthusiasm, his jaw tight. For a fleeting second, I almost pitied him. Almost. The award was smooth and heavy in my hands. The microphone shimmered beneath the stage lights. I took a breath. Thank you, I began. I built VeraVision so people could see what others refused to. Turns out that applies to more than technology. Laughter rippled softly through the crowd, uncertain but genuine. I left Charleston years ago believing that success meant being accepted. But what I've learned is this acceptance doesn't build anything. Conviction does. And sometimes the very silence people use to ignore you becomes the foundation you stand on. I paused, let the weight of that linger, then smiled. So tonight isn't about me coming home. It's about realizing I never needed permission to leave. The applause that followed felt different, warmer, freer. When I stepped down from the stage, the mayor shook my hand, reporters swarmed, and flashbulbs popped. But through it all, I saw my family still seated, still motionless, unsure how to react. Later, after the crowd began to thin, I found a quiet hallway near the gallery entrance. The air smelled of orchids and champagne. I needed a moment alone. That was when I heard his voice. Claire. My father. He walked toward me slowly. Shoulders squared every inch the businessman who still believed control could fix anything. You've done well, he said. I nodded. I know. He hesitated, searching for words that could rewrite years. We were hard on you. Maybe too hard. But it worked, didn't it? A small, humorless laugh escaped me. Is that what you tell yourself? He didn't answer. Then my mother appeared. Her eyes rimmed red, her hand clutching her purse like an anchor. We were wrong, she said softly. We should have believed in you. I studied her face, the same eyes I had once begged to understand me. You didn't have to believe in me, I said. I did. Ethan joined them, his tie loose, his expression sharp with resentment. So what now? You just act like we're strangers. No, I said, my tone calm. You're my family. You're part of my story. But I'm not part of yours anymore. He scoffed. You think this makes you better than us? I looked at him, looked, and saw not anger but envy, the kind that burns from the inside out. No, I said quietly. It just makes me free. They stood there, 3 silhouettes against the glowing hall, unsure what to do with a version of me that didn't need them anymore. I didn't hate them. I didn't love them either. I simply saw them as they were human, flawed, and powerless over me. I don't need an apology, I said, stepping past them. I just needed you to face the mirror I built. Outside, the city air was cool against my skin. Nora was waiting by the car, waving off a reporter. How was it, she asked. Loud, I said, smiling. But I think that's the last time I'll need to speak for a while. As we drove away, the lights of Charleston shimmered in the rearview mirror like the ghost of a place I'd already outgrown. Halfway across the bridge, Nora asked, What's next, living? I said simply. She laughed. That's it. No empire to build. No headlines to chase. That's the headline, I said. The wind whipped through the open window, tangling my hair, filling the car with salt air and freedom. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the hum of the tires blend with the ocean's steady rhythm. They once measured success in applause. I'd learned it was measured in peace. They once mistook my silence for surrender. I'd learned it was where strength grows. I didn't need them to see me anymore. I just needed to see myself. And now, I did. The road ahead stretched long and silver under the moonlight. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from anything. I was simply walking home on my own terms. It had been a year since the Charleston Gala, though sometimes it felt like a lifetime. The ocean outside my window shimmered silver under the morning sun waves breaking softly against the rocks like a rhythm I finally understood. I sat barefoot on the balcony, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and watched the world wake up. The air was calm, the kind of calm that comes only after you've survived a storm. ForeverThen had grown beyond anything I once dared to imagine. We have offices in Paris, London, and Tokyo now. Museums called us. Universities studied us. But I'd stopped counting milestones the way I used to. Numbers didn't thrill me anymore. Peace did. Every morning I walked along the waterfront before sunrise. Sometimes I left my shoes behind, letting the sand cling to my skin. There was something sacred about feeling grounded again, about knowing every step forward belonged to me. For years I chased proof. Now I just lived it. That morning an email from the Global Women's Summit blinked on my screen, invitation to keynote, the future she built. I'd said no to dozens of speeches before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about spotlight, it was about echo. I typed one line in reply, "I'll be there." Later that day, I wandered through our office, sunlight pouring through the glass walls. The space was alive with quiet laughter, sketches pinned to whiteboards, a team that moved like a heartbeat. I paused at one of the desks where a young designer, barely 23, was sculpting a digital landscape that looked like a dream. She looked up nervously when she saw me. "Does this look right?" she asked. "It looks like a possibility," I said. Her smile was shy but proud. Everywhere I turned, I saw fragments of my past. Rewritten, the people who worked here weren't just employees. They were reflections of what I'd once needed, believers, dreamers, survivors of being underestimated. Maybe that's what legacy really meant, creating what could have saved you. That afternoon, Nora came into my office holding an envelope. "You've got mail." "Real mail," I laughed. "Who still writes letters?" "Someone who probably doesn't know how to email." I opened it and my breath caught. The handwriting was instantly familiar. "Dear Claire, we saw your interview last month. Your father and I are proud of you. I hope one day we can start fresh. Love, Mom." I read it twice. The ache that used to come with her name wasn't there anymore. Just a quiet sadness, soft and worn at the edges. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel forgiveness in the way people expect. I just felt done. I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, not to remember, but because forgetting wasn't necessary either. Forgiveness doesn't need witnesses. It's something you do quietly for yourself. The night before my keynote speech, I couldn't sleep. The city buzzed faintly outside, and I stood by the window watching the lights flicker across the skyline. Somewhere out there, people were still doubting someone like me. Somewhere another girl was being told to stay quiet, to be practical, to shrink herself into someone's expectations. I hoped she'd hear my voice tomorrow and realize she didn't have to. The next morning, the auditorium glowed with soft golden lights. Thousands of women filled the seats, students, professionals, mothers, artists. Some were young and wide-eyed. Others carried years of silence in their posture. When I stepped onto the stage, the sound of applause rolled through the room like a wave. I took a deep breath and began. "I was told once that I'd be broke forever," I said. "That my ideas were too soft to matter. That I'd end up regretting every choice that didn't fit someone else's plan." I paused, scanning the crowd. Faces leaned forward, listening, connecting. They were wrong. Not because I proved them wrong, but because I stopped needing to. I realized something: you don't win by shouting back. You win by building something they can't ignore. A murmur of agreement moved through the audience. "I used to think revenge was about destruction," I continued. "It isn't. It's about becoming so whole that no one can reach the parts they tried to break." The applause was immediate, warm, and unstoppable. Some women stood, some wiped tears from their eyes. Nora stood backstage, her hands pressed together, smiling through them. When I left the stage, people reached for my hands, their faces full of gratitude and recognition. A woman in her 60s hugged me and whispered, "I waited my whole life to hear someone say that." For the first time, I realized that my story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to every person who'd ever been dismissed, diminished, or doubted, and found their way back anyway. A month later, I returned to Charleston for the first time since the awards. ForeverThen had sponsored a new exhibit at the local museum, Reconstructed Realities. One of the installations was mine. A digital recreation of the house I grew up in, only this version glowed. The walls shimmered with warmth instead of shadows. The dining table, once a stage for cruelty, now radiated light. I stood alone in front of it, surrounded by the quiet hum of visitors. The screen flickered softly, showing a small figure of a girl sitting at that table, sketchbook open, drawing the world she wanted to see. The girl looked peaceful. "They said I'd disappear without them," I whispered. "But I learned something about light. It doesn't need permission to shine." I walked through each room, touching the air, as though I could feel the past soften under my fingertips. The ghosts that once lived there didn't scare me anymore. They just existed like memories should. Outside the exhibit, sunlight poured through tall glass windows. A little girl tugged her mother's hand, pointing toward the installation. "I want to build something like that someday," she said. Her mother smiled. "Then you will." The girl turned to me, eyes bright with that wild, fearless kind of hope only children have. "Did you make that?" "Yes," I said. "A long time ago." "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you," I smiled. "So are you." She grinned and ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the hall. I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air thick with magnolia and sea salt. The city that once caged me now stood open, familiar, harmless. I slipped off my heels, walking barefoot along the museum steps, the marble warm beneath my feet. For a long moment I stood still, eyes closed, breathing. This was what victory really felt like, not the applause, not the recognition, but the quiet certainty that I had built something beautiful out of everything that tried to break me. They once said I'd be broke forever. Now I knew what I'd built was never just wealth. It was worth. And this peace, this life, this legacy, was the sweetest revenge of all.